Hi, I'm Lila. My mother looked me straight in the eye and said, "You're nothing but a waste of space in this house." My father nodded and pointed to the door. "Pack your things. You have until morning." So, at 16, with $43 in my pocket and a duffel bag that smelled like the basement where I'd been sleeping, I walked out into a Detroit winter that felt warmer than the home I was leaving behind. 15 years later, I signed the papers that made me the owner of their mortgage. The eviction notice I personally delivered to their front door simply read, "You have 30 days. No exceptions." Ever been told you're worthless by the people who were supposed to love you most? Sometimes the universe has a way of keeping score. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The February wind cut through my thin jacket like it had something personal against me as I stood on the front steps of 1247 Maple Ridge Drive. The house looked exactly the same as it did that morning when I was 16. White aluminum siding with green shutters that my mother had picked because she thought they made the place look distinguished. The paint was peeling, now around the window frames, and I could see where the gutter had come loose on the left side, probably from last winter's ice storms. But it was still the house where I'd grown up, where I'd learned to ride a bike in the driveway, where I'd built snow forts with my older brother Marcus before everything changed. I pulled my phone from my pocket and checked the time. 7:15 in the morning. My parents would be awake by now. Dad would be sitting at the kitchen table reading yesterday's newspaper because he was too cheap to get a digital subscription, and Mom would be standing at the counter making coffee in that ancient percolator that sounded like a freight train when it got going. The same routine they'd followed for as long as I could remember, the same routine they probably still followed now. The manila envelope felt heavier than it should have in my hands. Inside were copies of the mortgage transfer documents, the official notice of ownership change, and the eviction papers that would give them exactly 30 days to vacate the premises. 30 days to pack up 47 years of marriage and 22 years of raising children in this house. 30 days to figure out where they were going to live on Dad's Social Security and Mom's part-time income from the craft store where she worked 3 days a week. I hadn't slept much the night before, not because I was nervous or having second thoughts, but because I kept thinking about that last conversation we'd had when I was 16. How Mom had stood in almost this exact spot on the front porch, arms crossed, telling me that I was dragging the whole family down with my attitude problem and my complete lack of respect for authority. How Dad had stood behind her, silent, as always when it mattered, letting her do the talking while he avoided eye contact. "You think you know everything?" she'd said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You think you're smarter than everyone else in this house. Well, let's see how smart you are when you're out there in the real world with nobody to take care of. I remembered how my hands had shaken as I'd stuffed clothes into the old Army surplus duffel bag that had belonged to my grandfather. How I'd wanted to say something that would make her realize what she was doing, what she was throwing away. But the words had gotten stuck somewhere between my heart and my throat, and all I'd managed was a quiet goodbye that neither of them acknowledged. Now, standing here 15 years later, I wasn't shaking anymore. My hands were steady as I walked, up the 3 concrete steps to the front door, the same steps where I'd sat countless summer evenings watching the neighborhood kids play kickball in the street. The same steps where Marcus had taught me to tie my shoes when I was 5, patiently working with me for what felt like hours until I finally got it right. The doorbell still played the first few notes of Fur Elise, the same melody that had echoed through the house every time someone came to visit. I could hear movement inside, footsteps on the hardwood floor that Dad had installed himself the summer I turned 12. He'd been so proud of that floor, spent weeks getting every board perfectly aligned, every nail counter sunk just right. The door opened, and there was my mother, looking older than I'd expected but still recognizable. Her hair was shorter now, more gray than brown. and she'd put on weight in the way that happens gradually over years until one day you realize the person you're looking at isn't quite the same person you remember. She was wearing a faded blue bathrobe over flannel pajamas, and I could smell the coffee brewing in the kitchen behind her. Her eyes went from confusion to recognition to something that might have been fear, all in the space of about 3 seconds. She didn't say my name, didn't say anything at all for a moment, just stood there in the doorway like she was seeing a ghost. "Hello, Mom," I said, keeping my voice level and professional. "I have some documents for you and Dad, official business." She glanced at the envelope in my hands, then back at my face. "Lila," she said finally, and my name sounded strange in her voice, like she wasn't sure she was pronouncing it correctly. "What are you doing here?" "Like I said, official business. Is Dad home?" She nodded slowly, still staring at me like she was trying to figure out if I was real. "Robert," she called. Over her shoulder, not moving from the doorway. "Robert, you need to come here." I could hear his footsteps before I saw him, the familiar heavy tread of work boots on hardwood, even though he'd been retired from the factory for 3 years now. When he appeared behind Mom in the doorway, he looked almost exactly the same as he had 15 years ago. Maybe a little grayer around the temples, maybe a few more lines around his eyes, but still the same man who'd pointed to the door and told his 16-year-old daughter to figure life out on her own. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice carrying that same edge of suspicion it had always had when he talked to me. Like he was waiting for me to do something wrong, to prove once again that I was the problem child he'd always believed me to. I held out the envelope. "Mortgage transfer documents," I said. "As of yesterday, I'm the new owner of this property. You'll find an eviction notice inside, along with all the relevant legal paperwork. You have 30 days to vacate." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the coffee percolator burbling in the kitchen, could hear a dog barking somewhere down the street, could hear the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. Dad took the envelope with hands that weren't quite steady, opened it, and pulled out the papers. Mom leaned in to read over his shoulder, and I watched their faces change as they processed what they were seeing. Confusion first, then disbelief, then something that looked like panic. "This can't be legal," Mom said, her voice higher than usual. "You can't just buy someone's house out from under them." "Actually, I can," I replied. "When you default on your mortgage payments for 6 consecutive months, the bank has the right to sell the debt to a third party. I was that third party. Everything's been properly filed with the county clerk's office. You can verify it yourself if you'd like." Dad was still staring at the papers, flipping through them like he was hoping they might say something different if he read them again. "How did you even know we were behind on the mortgage?" "Public records," I said. "Default notices are a matter of public information. I've been tracking the financial status of this property for quite some time." That wasn't entirely true. I'd actually found out about their financial troubles through a mutual acquaintance, someone who'd mentioned in passing that the Hendersons on Maple Ridge were having money problems. It had taken me about 10 minutes of research to confirm that they were 3 months behind on their payments and another 2 weeks to navigate the process of purchasing their debt from the bank. "Why would you do this?" Mom asked, and for the first time since I'd knocked on the door, I heard something in her voice that sounded almost like the mother I remembered from when I was very small. Before Marcus started getting into trouble at school, before Dad started drinking more than he should, before everything in our family began to slowly fall apart. I looked at her for a long moment, remembering all the things I'd wanted to say to her over the years. All the angry letters I'd written and never sent. All the conversations I'd imagined having where I'd get to tell her exactly how much damage she'd done. But standing there on the front porch where she'd told me I was worthless, where she'd chosen to throw away her own daughter rather than deal with whatever problems she thought I represented, I found that I didn't want to give her a speech about karma or justice or getting what you deserve. Instead, I just said, because I could. The 3 of us stood there for another moment, the weight of 15 years hanging in the air between us like smoke. Then I turned and walked back down the steps, back to the car I'd parked at the curb, the same curb where I'd waited for the school bus every morning for 12 years. I didn't look back as I drove away, but I could see them in my rearview mirror, still standing in the doorway, still holding the papers that would change their lives forever. Just like they'd changed mine when I was 16 and stupid enough to believe that family meant something more than shared DNA and a mailing address. The drive back to my office took about 20 minutes, through neighborhoods that looked both familiar and foreign after all these years away. I'd built a good life in Chicago, a life that had nothing to do with Detroit or Maple Ridge Drive or parents who thought love was something you had to earn rather than something you gave freely. But coming back here, seeing the house where I'd grown up, had stirred up memories I'd thought I'd buried for good. I remembered being 10 years old and spending hours in my room reading library books while Mom and Dad fought downstairs about money, about Marcus, about everything except the things that really mattered. I remembered being 12 and trying to show them the science fair project I'd won first place with, only to have Dad grunt something about book learning not being as important as common sense. I remembered being 14 and asking if I could take advanced classes at school, only to have Mom tell me that I was getting too big for my britches and needed to remember where I came from. Most of all, I remembered being 16 and realizing that no matter what I did, no matter how hard I tried, I was never going to be the daughter they wanted me to be, the daughter who didn't ask questions, who didn't challenge their authority, who was content to live the same small life they'd chosen for themselves. So when they'd given me the choice between conforming and leaving, I'd chosen to leave. And I'd spent every day since then building something they'd never thought I was capable of building, a life that was entirely my own. The youth shelter on Grand River Avenue smelled like industrial disinfectant and desperation. It was a brick building that had probably been beautiful once, maybe back in the 1920s when Detroit was booming and people had hope for the future. Now it looked tired, with chipped paint around the windows and a front door that stuck when you tried to open it. But it was warm, and it was safe, and most importantly, it was somewhere I could stay without having to explain to anyone why a 16-year-old girl was sleeping in bus stations. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Mrs. Patterson ran the place with the kind of firm kindness that came from years of dealing with kids who'd been dealt bad hands. She was probably in her 50s, with graying hair that she kept pulled back in a neat bun, and reading glasses that hung from a chain around her neck. When I'd first walked through those doors 3 days after leaving Maple Ridge Drive, soaking wet from a sleet storm and carrying everything I owned in a bag that was coming apart at the seams, she'd taken one look at me and said, "You look like you could use some hot soup and a place to think." I'd been expecting questions, forms to fill out, maybe someone calling my parents to drag me back home. Instead, she'd led me to a small office behind the front desk, handed me a towel and a cup of tomato soup that was probably from a can, but tasted like the best thing I'd ever eaten, and waited for me to decide what I wanted to tell her. "I'm not going back," I'd said, the first words I'd spoken to anyone in 3 days. "Okay," she'd replied, like that was a perfectly reasonable statement from a teenager with no money and nowhere to go. "What do you want to do instead?" That question had caught me off guard. Nobody had ever asked me what I wanted to do. My parents had always told me what I should do, what I couldn't do, what was wrong with what I was doing. But what did I actually want? "I want to finish school," I'd said, surprising myself with how quickly the answer came. "And I want to go to college." Mrs. Patterson had nodded like this was exactly what she'd expected to hear. "Well then, we'd better figure out how to make that happen." The shelter had rules, of course. Everyone had to be in by 10 on weeknights, midnight on weekends. Everyone had to contribute to the communal chores, cleaning, cooking, basic maintenance. Everyone had to be enrolled in some kind of educational program, whether that was high, school, GED classes, or vocational training. And everyone had to meet with Mrs. Patterson once a week to talk about their goals and their progress toward achieving them. What the shelter didn't have was judgment. Nobody asked why you were there or where you'd come from. Nobody treated you like you were broken or defective because your family had given up on you. There were about 15 kids living there at any given time, ages ranging from 14 to 18, and we all understood that we were in the same boat. We were the ones who'd been discarded, the ones who'd been told we weren't worth the trouble. My roommate was a girl named Carmen who was 17 and had been bouncing between foster homes since she was 12. She had bright purple hair that she dyed herself in the communal bathroom, and a laugh that could fill up a whole room. She was also the smartest person I'd ever met, the kind of smart that comes from having to figure out how to survive when the adults in your life have failed you over and over again. The thing about being thrown away, she told me one night as we lay in our narrow beds listening to the sounds of the city outside our window, is that it teaches you what you're really made of. Most people never find that out because they never have to. Carmen was working on her GED while also taking community college classes in computer programming. She'd taught herself to code using library computers and free online tutorials, staying after school hours in the computer lab until the janitor kicked her out. She had a plan: get her GED, finish her associate's degree, transfer to a 4-year university for computer science, and eventually start her own tech company. You've got to have a plan, she'd say whenever one of the younger kids would complain about how unfair everything was. You can't control what happened to you before, but you can control what happens next. I threw myself into my schoolwork with the intensity of someone who finally understood that education was my way out. I'd always been a good student, but at home that had been treated like a character flaw, something that made me think I was better than everyone else. At the shelter, it was seen as an asset, something to be cultivated and encouraged. Mrs. Patterson helped me enroll at Renaissance High School, a public school that specialized in helping kids who'd had disrupted educational experiences. The teachers, there understood that their students might be dealing with homelessness, family problems, or other challenges that traditional schools weren't equipped to handle. They offered flexible schedules, intensive tutoring, and most importantly, they treated every student like they had potential. I took the bus to school every morning at 7:30, sat in the front row of every class, and stayed after school to use the library computers for homework and research. I discovered that I had a natural aptitude for mathematics and science, subjects that had clear rules and logical progressions. If you understood the principles and did the work, you got the right answer. There was no ambiguity, no subjectivity, no way for someone to tell you that your answer was wrong just because they didn't like your attitude. My physics teacher, Mr. Rodriguez, was the first adult who ever told me I had real academic potential. He was a young teacher, probably only 5 or 6 years out of college himself, with an enthusiasm for science that was infectious. When he talked about quantum mechanics or thermodynamics, his whole face would light up like he was sharing the secrets of the universe. You have an intuitive understanding of complex systems, he told me one afternoon after I'd stayed behind to ask questions about the homework assignment. Have you ever thought about pursuing engineering or computer science in college? College. The word hung in the air between us like something precious and fragile. I'd thought about it, of course, but in the abstract way you think about winning the lottery or discovering buried treasure. It was something that happened to other people, people whose parents had college funds and connections and expectations. I don't know how I'd pay for it, I said honestly. Mr. Rodriguez pulled out a stack of pamphlets from his desk drawer. There, are scholarships, he said. Grants for students from low-income families, work-study programs. Community college is affordable, and you can transfer to a 4-year school after you get your associate's degree. That night, I spread the pamphlets out on my narrow bed and read every word. Federal Pell Grants for students whose families made less than a certain amount per year. merit scholarships for students with high GPAs and test scores, work study, programs that would let me earn money while going to school. For the first time since I'd left home, I started to believe that maybe Carmen was right. Maybe I could control what happened next. I signed up to take the SATs and spent every free moment studying with prep books from the library. Carmen helped me practice the math sections, and Mrs. Patterson quizzed me on vocabulary words during our weekly meetings. When the scores came back, they were higher than I'd dared to hope. 1450 out of 1600, with particularly strong performance in math and science. You could get into some really good schools with scores like these, Mrs. Patterson said, looking over the results with a smile that made the whole room feel brighter. What are you thinking? I'd been thinking about it constantly, actually. During the long bus rides to school, during my shifts washing dishes in the shelter kitchen, during the quiet hours before dawn when I couldn't sleep and would lie awake planning my future. I wanted to study engineering, maybe electrical or computer, engineering. I wanted to understand how things worked, how to build systems that solved problems. I wanted to create something lasting and valuable. But more than that, I wanted to prove that the 16-year-old girl who'd been called a waste of space was capable of building something extraordinary. I applied to 12 colleges, a mix of in-state, schools where my tuition would be lower and prestigious out-of-state universities that offered generous financial aid packages. The application essays were the hardest part, trying to explain my circumstances without sounding like I was asking for pity. I wrote about resilience and determination and the lessons you learn when you have to rebuild your life from nothing. Carmen helped me with the essays, reading draft after draft and offering suggestions. Don't focus on what they did to you, she advised. Focus on what you did with it. Show them that you're not a victim, you're a survivor who's ready to take on the world. The acceptance letters started arriving in March of my senior year. Wayne State University, University of Michigan, Michigan State, even a few out-of-state schools that I'd applied to on a whim. Each envelope felt like validation, proof that someone believed I was worth investing in. But the letter that changed everything came from Northwestern University in Illinois. Full ride scholarship, covering tuition, room, board, and books for all 4 years. The letter was signed by the dean of the engineering school, and it included a handwritten note. Your essay about overcoming adversity was one of the most compelling pieces of writing our admissions committee has ever read. We believe you have enormous potential, and we want to help you realize it. I read that letter sitting on my bed in the shelter, surrounded by the other acceptance letters I'd received. Carmen was bouncing around the room like she'd won the lottery herself, and Mrs. Patterson was wiping tears from her eyes with a tissue she'd pulled from the box she kept on her desk for occasions like this. Northwestern, Mrs. Patterson said, shaking her head in amazement. Do you know how prestigious that school is? This is a full ride to one of the best engineering programs in the country. I knew. I'd done my research, spent hours reading about their faculty and their research programs and the companies that recruited their graduates. It was the kind of opportunity that most people only dreamed about, the kind of chance that could change the entire trajectory of a person's life. And I'd earned it. Not because of who my parents were or how much money my family had, but because of my own hard work and determination. Because I'd refused to let other people's limitations become my own. When I graduated from high school that June, Mrs. Patterson and Carmen and a handful of the other shelter residents came to the ceremony. I walked across that stage in a cap and gown that the school had provided, knowing that I was walking toward a future that was entirely of my own making. My parents weren't there, of course. I hadn't spoken to them since the morning I'd left, and I had no intention of reaching out now. This was my victory, built on my own foundation, and I didn't need their approval to make it real. Northwestern. University's campus in Evanston felt like stepping into a different world. The Gothic Revival buildings with their limestone facades and ivy-covered walls spoke of tradition and permanence. of a kind of institutional stability I'd never experienced. Students walked across the quad carrying expensive laptops and wearing clothes that probably cost more than I'd spent on everything I owned. But I wasn't intimidated. If anything, I was energized. This was exactly where I belonged, even if I'd taken a different path to get here than most of my classmates. My dorm room in Willard Residential College was small but comfortable, with a window that looked out over Lake Michigan. My roommate was a girl named Ashley from Connecticut, whose father was a hedge fund manager and whose mother sat on the boards of several charitable organizations. She was pleasant enough, but we lived in completely different universes. She talked about summer houses in the Hamptons and ski trips to Aspen, like they were normal parts of everyone's childhood experience. I didn't talk much about my background. When people asked where I was from, I said Detroit and changed the subject. When they asked about my family, I said we weren't close and left it at that. It wasn't that I was ashamed of where I'd come from, but I'd learned that most people didn't know how to respond when you told them you'd been homeless at 16. They either got uncomfortable and pitying, or they started treating you like some kind of inspirational curiosity. I preferred to let my work speak for itself. The engineering program at Northwestern was everything I'd hoped it would be, and more challenging than anything I'd ever experienced. Calculus 3, Physics for Engineers, Introduction to Computer Programming, Materials Science. The coursework was demanding and relentless. But for the first time in my life, I was surrounded by professors who expected excellence and peers who shared my passion for understanding how things worked. My favorite class was Introduction to Electrical Engineering, taught by Professor Elizabeth Chen, a brilliant woman who'd made groundbreaking contributions to semiconductor research before moving into academia. She had a way of explaining complex concepts that made them seem not just comprehensible but elegant. When she talked about current flow and voltage drops, about resistance and capacitance, it was like she was revealing the hidden language that governed the modern world. I spent most of my free time in the engineering lab, working on projects, and helping other students with concepts they were struggling with. The lab stayed open until midnight, and I was usually one of the last students to leave, often walking back to my dorm through the quiet campus with my mind still buzzing with ideas and possibilities. It was during my sophomore year that I first heard from Marcus. I was in my advanced circuit analysis class when my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Hey sis, it's Marcus. Can we talk?" I stared at the message for a long moment, feeling my heart rate spike. Marcus was 3 years older than me, and we'd been close when we were kids. He'd been the one who'd taught me to ride a bike, who'd helped me with homework when I was struggling in elementary school, who'd stood up for me when the neighborhood kids made fun of my secondhand clothes. But he'd also been the reason our parents had started drinking more, staying out later, getting into the kind of trouble that made teachers call home and neighbors whisper. By the time I was in high school, Marcus had been in and out of jail twice, for drug possession and theft. He'd stolen money from Mom's purse, pawned Dad's tools, and brought a parade of sketchy friends through our house at all hours of the day and night. My parents had blamed his problems on everything except his own choices: bad influences, the school system, the neighborhood, even me for being a bad example with my academic focus and refusal to join in family dysfunction. I'd tried to help him when I was younger, covering for him when he came home high, lying to our parents about where he'd been and what he'd been doing. But eventually I'd realized that trying to save someone who didn't want to be saved was just another way of drowning yourself. I didn't respond to his text that day, or the 3 that followed over the next week. But he was persistent, and eventually, I agreed to meet him for coffee at a shop near campus. I told myself it was curiosity more than anything else, a desire to see how he'd changed in the 4 years since I'd left home. He looked older than his 24 years, with the kind of weathered face that comes from too much stress and not enough sleep. But he was clean, or at least he appeared to be, and when he smiled at me across the small table, I caught a glimpse of the brother I'd loved when we were children. "You look good, Lila," he said, and his voice carried a note of genuine pride that I hadn't expected. College life must be treating you well? It is, I said carefully. What about you? What are you doing now? He told me he'd been clean for 8 months, that he was working construction and living in a halfway house on the east side of Detroit. He'd gotten his GED and was thinking about enrolling in community college classes. He seemed genuinely committed to turning his life around, and despite my better judgment, I found myself wanting to believe him. I owe you an apology, he said about halfway through our conversation. For a lot of things, but especially for what happened when you left. I should have stood up for you. I should have told them they were making a mistake. It's in the past, I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. No, it's not, he insisted. They were wrong to throw you out like that. You were just a kid, and you were the only one in that house who had her act together. I was the screw-up, not you. We talked for about an hour, catching up on the basics of our lives without delving too deeply into the painful history between us. When he asked about my studies, I found myself opening up more than I'd intended, telling him about my research projects and my plans for graduate school. He listened with what seemed like genuine interest, asking intelligent questions about my work. As we were getting ready to leave, he mentioned something that made my blood run cold. Mom and Dad have been having some money problems, he said casually, like he was mentioning the weather. Dad got laid off from the plant last year, and they're struggling to make ends meet. Mom's been talking about maybe reaching out to you, seeing if you might be willing to help out. I felt like someone had poured ice water down my spine. Help out how? I don't know exactly. Maybe some financial support? They know you're at Northwestern, and Mom seems to think that means you must be doing pretty well for yourself. Marcus, I said slowly, I'm here on financial aid. I work in the dining hall 20 hours a week just to cover my personal expenses. I don't have money to send home. I told her that, he said quickly. I told her you're still a student, that you're probably broke like every other college kid. But she's got this idea that you must be connected to wealthy people now, that maybe you could ask someone for help. The audacity of it took my breath away. They'd thrown me out with nothing, called me worthless, told me I was a waste of space in their own home, and now, 5 years later, they thought they could use my success as a way to solve their financial problems. She actually said that? I asked. That I should ask other people for money to help them? Marcus looked uncomfortable. You know how she gets when she's stressed about money. She's not thinking clearly. But I knew better. This was exactly how my mother had always thought. Other people existed to serve her needs, to solve her problems, to make her life easier. The idea that I might have worked hard to build something for myself, that I might have my own goals and priorities, wouldn't even occur to her. Over the next few weeks, the messages from Marcus became more frequent and more urgent. Dad's unemployment. Benefits were running out. They were behind on the mortgage. The car needed repairs they couldn't afford. Each message came with the subtle implication that I had some obligation to help, that my success somehow created a debt I owed to the family. That had rejected me. I started screening my calls and ignoring most of his texts. But Marcus was nothing if not persistent, and eventually he called me from a different number while I was walking back from the library late one evening. Lila, please don't hang up, he said as soon as I answered. I need to tell you something. Important. Marcus, I can't keep having this conversation. I told you I don't have money to send home. It's not about that, he said, though his tone suggested it absolutely was about that. Mom wants to come see you. She wants to drive up to Evanston and talk to you in person. The thought of my mother, showing up on campus, possibly causing a scene in my dorm or in front of my classmates, made my stomach clench with anxiety. No, I said firmly. Absolutely not. She's really struggling, Lila. She cries every night about the money situation. She keeps saying she made a mistake with you, that she should have handled things differently. If she wants to apologize, she can do it over the phone. But I'm not going to let her ambush me at school. It's not an ambush, Marcus protested. She just wants to see you, to talk things through. Maybe you two could work something out. Work something out. As if my relationship with my parents was a business negotiation, something that could be resolved with the right terms and conditions. As if 5 years of silence could be erased with a single conversation and a promise to send money home every month. Marcus, I need you to listen to me very carefully, I said, stopping in the middle of the sidewalk. I am not giving them money. I am not asking my professors or my classmates or anyone else for money on their behalf. And if Mom shows up here uninvited, I will call campus security. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Marcus spoke again, his voice was colder than it had been before. You really have changed, he said. You used to care about your family. Family, I repeated, tasting the bitterness of the word. Is that what you call people who throw their 16-year-old daughter out on the street? People who only reach out when they need something? They made mistakes, he said. But they're still your parents. No, I said quietly. They're not. They gave up that right when they chose to prioritize their own comfort over their daughter's safety. I hung up and turned off my phone, walking, the rest of the way back to my dorm in silence. But I knew this wasn't over. I'd seen the desperation in Marcus's voice, heard the undertone of manipulation that I remembered so well from my childhood. They weren't going to give up easily, and they weren't going to accept no for an answer. 2 weeks later, the letter arrived. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, slipped under my dorm room door while I was at my 8 a.m. thermodynamics class. I almost stepped on it when I came back to grab my laptop before heading to the lab. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive-looking, with my name written in my mother's familiar handwriting across the front. No return address, but I recognized the careful loops and flourishes she'd always used when she wanted to appear more sophisticated than she actually was. I sat on my narrow dorm bed and stared at it for a full 5 minutes before opening it. Ashley had already left for her art history seminar, so I had the room to myself. Outside, I could hear the sounds of campus life, students calling to each other as they walked between classes, the distant hum of traffic on Sheridan Road, the rhythmic thud of someone playing basketball on the court behind our building. Inside the envelope were 3 items: a handwritten letter on matching stationery, a copy of a foreclosure notice from First National Bank of Detroit, and a photograph. That made my hand shake when I saw it. The photo was old, probably taken when I was about 7 or 8. It showed Marcus and me building a snowman in the backyard of the house on Maple Ridge Drive. I was wearing a red winter coat that had been too big for me then, hand-me-down mittens that didn't match, and a knit hat with a pom-pom that kept falling over my eyes. Marcus was crouched next to me, helping me roll the snowman's middle section, both of us grinning at whoever had been behind the camera. Probably Dad, back when he still occasionally joined in family activities. I remembered that day clearly. It had been one of those perfect winter Saturdays when the snow was exactly the right consistency for packing, when the cold air made your cheeks sting but didn't quite penetrate through your layers of clothing. Marcus had been 16 then, old enough to think he was too cool for building snowmen. But he'd come outside anyway when he'd seen me struggling to roll the base by myself. "This is how you do it, kiddo," he'd said, showing me how to pack the snow tight and keep the ball round as we rolled it across the yard. You've got to be patient with it. Can't rush the process. The letter was 2 pages long, written in my mother's careful script. "My dearest Lila," it began, and I could almost hear her voice in the formal tone she used when she was trying to sound more educated than her high school diploma and community college business classes had actually made her. "I hope this letter finds you well and thriving in your studies. Marcus has told me wonderful things about your achievements at Northwestern, and I want you to know how proud your father and I are of what you've accomplished. We always knew you were destined for great things." I stopped reading and looked at that sentence again. Always knew I was destined for great things. The woman who'd called me a waste of space, who'd told me I thought I was better than everyone else, who'd watched me pack my belongings into a garbage bag without saying a word to stop it, now claimed she'd always believed in my potential. The letter continued with several paragraphs about how much they missed me, how they regretted the way things had ended, how they'd been young and foolish, and hadn't known how to handle a strong-willed teenager. There were mentions of sleepless nights spent worrying about me, of prayers for my safety and success, of conversations where they'd wondered what I was doing and whether I was happy. It was masterfully written manipulation, designed to rewrite history and make me question my own memories of what had actually happened. But I'd spent too many years in therapy sessions at Northwestern's counseling center, working through the trauma of family rejection to fall for it now. The real purpose of the letter came in the final paragraphs. As you can see from the enclosed notice, we are facing some very serious financial difficulties. Your father's layoff last year depleted our savings, and despite our best efforts to find alternative employment, we have fallen behind on our mortgage payments. The bank has begun foreclosure proceedings, and we have 30 days to bring our account current or lose the house. I know this is a lot to ask, and I know we haven't been the parents we should have been to you, but you are our daughter, and family is supposed to take care of family. We raised you in this house, gave you a foundation that helped you become the successful young woman you are today. Marcus tells me you've made connections at university, people with resources who might be willing to help. We need $47,000 to stop the foreclosure. It's a large sum, I know, but with your education and your contacts, surely you can find a way to help us. We're not asking for charity. We would pay back every penny once your father finds steady work again. Please don't let pride or past hurts prevent you from helping your family in our time of greatest need. We love you, sweetheart, and we know you love us too deep down. Family forgives, family helps. Family doesn't abandon each other when times get hard. All our love, Mom and Dad. I read the letter twice, then set it aside and picked up the foreclosure notice. It was real, stamped, and signed by bank officials with legal language that left no doubt about the seriousness of their situation. They had indeed fallen behind on their mortgage payments, not just the current month, but 6 months' worth, totaling $18,000 in past due payments plus penalties and fees. But here's what the letter didn't mention. The foreclosure notice was dated 4 months ago. This wasn't a sudden crisis that had just emerged. They'd been facing this situation for months and had chosen not to reach out until they were completely out of options. They hadn't contacted me because they wanted a relationship. They'd contacted me because they needed money, and I was their last resort. I spent the rest of that day in a strange fog, going through the motions of attending classes and working my shift at the dining hall while my mind churned over the implications of what I'd received. During my break between my materials science lecture and my lab session, I walked to the library and found a quiet corner where I could think. The photo kept drawing my attention. That little girl in the oversized coat, so happy to be building something with her big brother, so innocent of what was coming. What would I tell that child if I could go back in time? Would I warn her that the people she loved most in the world would eventually decide she was disposable? Or would I let her have those few more years of believing that families were supposed to love each other unconditionally? That evening, I called Mrs. Patterson at the youth shelter. She'd given me her direct number when I'd graduated high school, telling me that I should reach out if I ever needed guidance or just someone to talk to who understood where I'd come from. I'd called her a few times during my freshman year when the adjustment to college life had felt overwhelming, and she'd always been a steady, rational voice of support. "Lila," she said when she heard my voice, and I could hear the smile in her tone. "How are you, honey? How's school going?" "School is good," I said. "But I got a letter from my parents today, and I'm not sure how to process it." I told her about the letter, the foreclosure notice, and the photo. Mrs. Patterson listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of understanding or disapproval. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "What do you think they want from you?" she asked finally. "Money," I said without hesitation. "They want me to somehow come up with $47,000 to save their house. And what do you think about that?" It was the same kind of question she'd asked me during our weekly meetings at the shelter, designed to help me think through my own feelings rather than just react emotionally to the situation. "I think they're trying to manipulate me," I said, slowly. "The letter talks about family loyalty and forgiveness, but they only reached out because they need something. If they'd really been worried about me all these years, they would have tried to contact me before now." "That sounds like a very mature assessment," Mrs. Patterson said. "What are you planning to do?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me wants to just throw the letter away and pretend I never got it. But another part of me feels guilty, like maybe I should try to help them somehow." "Lila," Mrs. Patterson said gently, "do you remember what we used to talk about regarding guilt and obligation?" Did remember. We'd had many conversations about the difference between healthy relationships based on mutual respect and love, and unhealthy relationships based on guilt, fear, and obligation. She'd helped me understand that just because someone was related to you didn't mean you owed them anything, especially if they'd failed in their fundamental responsibilities as parents. "You taught me that I don't owe anyone my success," I said, "that the things I've accomplished belong to me, not to people who chose not to support me when I needed them." "That's right," she said. "And that's still true now. You've worked incredibly hard to build the life you have. You've overcome obstacles that would have defeated most people. You don't owe anyone an explanation for your choices, and you certainly don't owe anyone the fruits of your labor." We talked for another 20 minutes, and by the time I hung up, I felt clearer about what I needed to do. But first, I needed more information. The next day, I skipped my usual study session and instead spent the afternoon in the library researching public records online. Wayne County, Michigan had digitized most of their property and court records, making it possible to track the history of my parents' financial troubles from my laptop. What I found was illuminating and deeply disturbing. The foreclosure proceedings had indeed begun 4 months ago, but the financial problems went back much further than that. My parents had refinanced their house 3 times in the past 8 years, each time taking cash out of their equity. They'd used the house like a piggy bank, extracting money whenever they needed it for other expenses. I found court records showing that they'd been sued by credit card companies multiple times. There were liens against the property from unpaid medical bills and defaulted personal loans. My father had been laid off not once but twice in the past 3 years, and each time they'd fallen behind on their mortgage payments before eventually catching up with money from another refinancing. But the most shocking discovery came when I searched for Marcus's criminal record. I'd known about his early arrests for drug possession and petty theft, but there was much more recent activity that he hadn't mentioned during our coffee meeting. He'd been arrested for check fraud just 6 months ago, charged with writing bad checks totaling nearly $3,000. The case was still pending, with a court date scheduled for next month. I sat back in my library chair, staring at the computer screen, and feeling like I was seeing my family clearly for the first time. This wasn't a family facing an unexpected crisis. This was a family that had been making destructive financial decisions for years, living beyond their means and using credit and refinancing to maintain a lifestyle they couldn't afford. And now, they wanted me to bail them out, to use my education and my connections to solve problems they'd created through their own poor choices. They wanted me to ask my professors and classmates, people who respected me for my academic achievements and my character, to give money to a family that had thrown me away when I was 16 years old. I printed out copies of everything I'd found and put them in a folder. Then I went back to my dorm room and wrote my response. I didn't send a letter back. Instead, I did something that would have been unthinkable to the 16-year-old girl who'd walked out of their house with nothing but a duffel bag and $43. I bought a plane ticket to Detroit. The decision came to me during my advanced electromagnetics class on a Friday morning in late March. Professor Chen was explaining the principles of electromagnetic induction, drawing wave patterns on the whiteboard with precise, confident strokes. And something about the predictable nature of physics clicked with my own situation. Action and reaction, force and resistance, cause and effect. My parents had applied pressure, expecting me to bend like I had when I was a child. But I wasn't that child anymore. I was someone who understood how systems worked, who could analyze problems and engineer solutions. And I'd decided it was time to engineer a solution to this problem once and for all. I flew into Detroit Metropolitan Airport on Saturday afternoon and took a taxi to a hotel near the airport. I'd deliberately chosen not to stay anywhere close to my old neighborhood, wanting neutral territory for what I planned to do. The hotel was nothing fancy, but it was clean and anonymous, the kind of place where business travelers stayed when they had unpleasant meetings to conduct. That evening, I called Marcus from my hotel room. "Lila?" His voice was surprised, hopeful. "Did you get Mom's letter? Are you calling about helping with the house?" "I got the letter," I said. "And I'm in Detroit. I want to meet with all of you tomorrow. Mom, Dad, and you." "You're here? In Detroit?" The excitement in his voice was almost childlike. "That's amazing. I knew you'd come through for us. Mom's going to be so relieved." "Marcus," I said carefully, "I didn't say I was here to help. I said I was here to meet. There's a difference." The excitement dimmed slightly. "Okay, but you're here, right? That means you're at least considering it." "I'm considering a lot of things." "Can you set up the meeting for tomorrow afternoon? Somewhere public?" We arranged to meet at a restaurant called The Mill, a family place on 8 Mile Road that I remembered from my childhood. It was the kind of restaurant where my parents had taken us for birthday dinners and special occasions, back when we'd still functioned as something resembling a normal family. I spent most of Saturday night awake, going over what I planned to say and how I expected them to respond. I'd printed out copies of all the public records I'd found, organized them chronologically, and put them in a manila folder that sat on the hotel room desk like evidence for a trial, which, in a way, it was. That Sunday afternoon arrived gray and drizzly, typical Michigan spring weather that couldn't decide whether it wanted to be winter or summer. I drove my rental car through neighborhoods that looked both familiar and foreign, past the elementary school where I'd learned to read, past the park where Marcus had taught me to throw a football, past the grocery store where my mother had worked part-time when money was especially tight. The mill looked exactly the same as it had 15 years ago. Red vinyl booths, wood-paneled walls covered with vintage advertisements, and the smell of fried food and coffee that seemed to have soaked into the very foundation of the building. I arrived 10 minutes early and asked the hostess for a booth. In the back, somewhere we could talk without being overheard. My parents arrived first, looking older and more worn than I'd expected. My father's hair had gone completely gray, and he moved with the careful gait of someone whose back bothered him constantly. My mother had gained weight and dyed her hair an unnatural shade of auburn that didn't quite suit her skin tone. They both looked nervous, glancing around the restaurant like they weren't sure they belonged there. They slid into the booth across from me, and for a moment, nobody spoke. It was my mother who broke the silence. "Lila, honey," she said, reaching across the table like she was going to touch my hand. I pulled back instinctively, and she let her hand fall. "You look wonderful. College has been good to you." "Has it?" I asked. "How would you know?" The question hung in the air between us, sharp and uncomfortable. My father cleared his throat. "We know we haven't been in touch," he said. "But that doesn't mean we haven't thought about you. We've worried about you every day since you left." Worried enough to call, to write, to make any effort at all to find out if I was alive? We didn't know how, my mother said quickly. We didn't know where you were, didn't know if you'd want to hear from us. You knew I was at Northwestern. Marcus found me easily enough when you needed something. Marcus arrived then, sliding into the booth next to our parents and immediately launching into damage control mode. Lila, we're all here because we care. About each other, he said. We're family, and families work through their problems together. I opened the manila folder and pulled out the first document. Let's talk about problems, I said. Let's start with the fact that this foreclosure didn't just happen. You've been behind on your mortgage payments 6 different times in the past 8 years. I slid the document across the table. My father picked it up, glanced at it, then set it down without comment. That's not the point, my mother said. Everyone falls behind sometimes. The important thing is that we need help now. No, I said, pulling out the next document. The important thing is the pattern. 3 refinances in 8 years, each time taking money out of the house. Multiple lawsuits from credit card companies. Liens for unpaid medical bills and personal loans. I spread the papers across the table like I was laying out a hand of cards. This isn't a family facing a crisis. This is a family that's been living beyond their means for years and expecting someone else to bail them out when the bills come due. Where did you get these? My father asked, his voice tight. Public records. All of it available online to anyone. Who knows where to look? I turned to Marcus. Including your arrest for check fraud 6 months ago. The case that's still pending. Were you planning to mention that? Marcus's face flushed red. That was a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding that involved writing $3,000 worth of bad checks. We all make mistakes, my mother said, but her voice was defensive now, the artificial sweetness from her letter completely gone. You're not perfect either, Lila. You're right, I said. I'm not perfect, but I've never asked anyone else to pay for my mistakes. I've never expected anyone else to solve my problems for me. We raised you, my father said, leaning forward across the table. We fed you and clothed you and put a roof over your head for 16 years. That has to count for something. The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they hurt, but because they revealed so much about how he saw our relationship. To him, parenting was a transaction. He'd provided the basic necessities of life, and now I owed him a return on his investment. You're right, I said quietly. You did feed me, and clothe me, and put a roof over my head. For 16 years, you fulfilled the legal obligations of parenthood, and then you decided those obligations were too much trouble, so you kicked me out. That's not how it happened, my mother protested, isn't it? I pulled out my phone and opened a voice recording app. Do you mind if I record this? I want to make sure I remember everything accurately. You can't record us without our permission, Marcus said. Actually, Michigan is a one-party consent state. As long as one person in the conversation agrees to be recorded, it's perfectly legal, and I agree. I hit record and set the phone on the table between us. Now, I said, let's talk about exactly how it happened. Mom, do you remember what you said to me the night before I left? She was quiet for a long moment, probably trying to decide how much she wanted to admit with the recording running. We were having problems with you, she said finally. You were disrespectful, argumentative. You wouldn't follow the rules. What rules? House rules. Curfew, chores, treating your parents with respect. I had a 10 o'clock curfew on school nights and midnight on weekends. I did my own laundry and kept my room clean. I got straight A's and never missed a day of school. I leaned forward. What I wouldn't do was pretend that Marcus's drug problem didn't exist. I wouldn't lie to your friends about why he kept disappearing. I wouldn't cover for him when he stole money from your purse or brought dealers to the house. That's enough, my father said. No, it's not enough. Because you want to rewrite history now. You want to pretend that you were loving parents who made a difficult decision about a troubled teenager. But the truth is that you chose to protect your son's addiction over your daughter's future. The restaurant had gotten quieter around us, other diners perhaps sensing the tension at our table. My mother was crying now, quiet tears that she wiped away with a paper napkin. "We made mistakes," she said. "We were young. We didn't know how to handle everything that was happening. But we love you, Lila. We've always loved you." "Love isn't a feeling," I said. "It's a choice. It's a series of actions that demonstrate care and commitment and sacrifice. You chose Marcus's comfort over my safety. You chose your own peace of mind over your daughter's well-being. That wasn't love. That was convenience." I gathered up the papers and put them back in the folder. "I'm not giving you money," I said. "I'm not asking my professors or my classmates to give you money. I'm not helping you save a house that you've already mortgaged 3 times to fund a lifestyle you can't afford." "So you're just going to let us lose everything?" Marcus asked. "You've already lost everything that mattered," I said, standing up from the booth. "You lost it the day you decided that being right was more important than being a family." I left a $20 bill on the table to cover my coffee and walked toward the exit. Behind me, I could hear my mother calling my name, but I didn't turn around. In the parking lot, my father caught up with me. "Lila, wait," he said, slightly out of breath. "Please." I stopped beside my rental car but didn't turn to face him. "What? You said in there," he continued, "about us choosing Marcus over you. That's not how we saw it at the time." "How did you see it?" We thought you were strong enough to handle anything. Marcus was falling apart, and you seemed like you had everything figured out. We thought if we could just get him straightened out, then we could focus on being the family we wanted to be." I turned around then and looked at him. He seemed smaller than I remembered, more fragile. For a moment, I caught a glimpse of the father who'd taught me to ride a bike, who'd helped me with math homework, who'd been proud of my good grades before he'd decided they were a threat to family harmony. "Dad," I said gently, "I was 16 years old. I didn't have anything figured out. I was just trying to survive in a house where nobody seemed to notice that I existed unless I was causing problems." He nodded slowly, tears in his eyes. "We should have done better." "Yes," I said. "You should have." I got in the car and drove away, leaving him standing in the parking lot of a restaurant where we'd once celebrated my 13th birthday, back, when I'd still believed that families were supposed to take care of each other no matter what. 5 years passed like pages turning in a book I was finally writing for myself. Northwestern became a distant but cherished memory as I threw myself into building the career I'd dreamed about during those long nights at the youth shelter. My first job out of college was with a renewable energy startup in Austin, Texas, where I designed power management systems for commercial solar installations. The work was challenging, the hours were long, and the pay was exactly what a young engineer with 2 patents and a reputation for solving impossible problems deserved. I lived in a small apartment near downtown Austin, spent my weekends hiking in the hill country, and slowly began to understand what normal people meant when they talked about work-life balance. For the first time in my life, I wasn't fighting for survival or proving that I deserved to exist. I was simply living, building something meaningful with my hands and my mind, earning respect through competence rather than begging for it through compliance. The patents kept coming. Power inverter efficiency improvements, battery thermal management systems, smart grid integration protocols. Each one represented months of research and testing, late nights in the lab, and the kind of focused problem-solving that had always been my escape from emotional chaos. By the time I turned 27, I was holding 8 patents and had been recruited by 3 different Fortune 500 companies. I chose Meridian Energy Solutions, a company based in Phoenix that was pioneering large-scale energy storage systems for utility companies. The signing bonus alone was more money than my parents had ever seen in a single year, and my starting salary was enough to buy the kind of house I'd dreamed about when I was 16 and sleeping on a cot in a youth shelter. But money I learned, was just a tool. What mattered was the freedom it bought me, the security it provided, and the choices it made possible. I could travel to conferences in Stockholm and Tokyo. I could invest in my own research projects. I could help fund scholarships. For kids aging out of foster care, I could build the kind of life where family drama was something that happened to other people, which is why the phone call caught me so completely off guard. It was a Thursday evening in October, and I was in my home office reviewing technical specifications for a new battery management system when my phone rang. The number had a Detroit area code, but it wasn't one I recognized. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. Lila? This is Dr. Sarah Hernandez from Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit. I'm calling about Marcus Rivera. You're listed as his emergency contact. My blood turned to ice water. What happened? Is he okay? He was in a car accident this afternoon. He's stable now, but he's been asking for you. Are you able to come to Detroit? I was on a plane 6 hours later. Marcus looked smaller in the hospital bed than I remembered, with bandages across his forehead and his left arm in a cast. But his eyes were clear when I walked into the room, and he managed a weak smile. Hey, college girl, he said, using the nickname he'd given me when I'd first started taking advanced classes in high school. Thanks for coming. What happened? Drunk driver ran a red light. Hit me on the passenger side when I was coming home from work. He shifted carefully in the bed. Could have been worse. Could have been a lot worse. I sat in the plastic chair next to his bed and looked at my older brother. Really looked at him. For the first time in years. He was thinner than he'd been as a teenager, with lines around his eyes that suggested he'd lived through more than his fair share of hard times. But there was something different about him, too. Something calmer and more centered than the volatile young man I remembered. How long have you been clean? I asked. He didn't seem surprised by the question. 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days. Not that I'm counting or anything. What changed? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ceiling tiles. I got tired of being the problem, he said finally. Tired of being the reason everything went wrong, the reason people gave up, the reason families fell apart. I wanted to figure out how to be something else. Are Mom and Dad still living in the trailer? Yeah, Dad's working part-time at a lumberyard now, but it's not enough to cover much more than rent and groceries. Mom's health isn't great. Diabetes, high blood pressure, arthritis in her hands. They're getting by, but just barely. I waited for the request, the subtle suggestion that maybe I could help out, the guilt trip about family obligations. But it didn't come. Marcus just lay there, looking tired and thoughtful. I've been thinking about calling you for a while, he said. Not for money or anything like that. Just to, I don't know, to see how you were doing. To apologize, maybe. Apologize for what? For not standing up for you when we were kids. For letting them throw you out like that. For being so messed up that they thought choosing between us was the only option. His words hit me harder than I'd expected. I'd spent so many years being angry at my parents that I'd almost forgotten to be angry at Marcus for his role in everything that had happened. You were just a kid too, I said. A kid with problems. I was old enough to know right from wrong. Old enough to know that what they did to you was wrong. He turned his head to look at me. I should have left with you. We should have stuck together. You weren't in any shape to take care of yourself, let alone me. No. But I could have tried. I could have at least told them they were making a mistake. We talked for another hour, carefully navigating around the landmines of our shared history, while trying to figure out what kind of relationship we might be able to build as adults. Marcus told me about his job at an auto repair shop, about the narcotics. Anonymous meetings he attended twice a week, about the apartment he shared with 2 other guys in recovery. I'm not asking you to forgive them, he said as visiting hours were ending. "I'm not even asking you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know that I understand now what we lost when you left. And I'm sorry it took me so long to figure it out. I stayed in Detroit for 3 days while Marcus recovered, visiting him each day and slowly piecing together the story of what had happened to our family after I'd left. The foreclosure had gone through 18 months after our confrontation at the restaurant. My parents had moved into a trailer park in Roseville, a community of mostly older people living on fixed incomes. Dad had found part-time work when he could, but his age and lack of specialized skills limited his options. Mom had taken a job at a discount grocery store, working 4-hour shifts that didn't qualify her for benefits but provided enough income to keep them from qualifying for most assistance programs. They existed in that gray area between poverty and stability, making too much money to get help, but not enough to actually get ahead. Marcus had moved out of their house before the foreclosure, getting clean in a residential treatment program, and then transitioning to a halfway house. He'd been working steadily for 2 years, slowly rebuilding his life and his relationship with our parents. Not because he owed them anything, he explained, but because he'd learned that forgiveness was something you did for yourself, not for other people. On my last day in Detroit, I did something I hadn't planned to do. I drove out to Roseville to see where my parents were living. The trailer park was exactly what I'd expected. Rows of manufactured homes in various states of repair, with small yards and older residents who'd found themselves priced out of traditional housing. My parents' trailer was at the end of a quiet street, with a small garden in front where someone had been growing tomatoes and peppers. I didn't knock on the door. I just sat in my rental car for a few minutes, looking at the place where the people who'd raised me were living out what were probably their final years. It wasn't squalor, exactly, but it was a far cry from the middle-class respectability they'd worked so hard to maintain when I was growing up. I thought about the 16-year-old girl who'd walked out of their house with nothing, and I tried to imagine what she would feel about seeing them reduced to this. Probably satisfaction, maybe even joy. She'd wanted them to suffer consequences for their choices, wanted them to understand what it felt like to lose everything. But I wasn't 16 anymore, and satisfaction felt different than I'd expected. Emptier. More complicated. That evening, I had dinner with Marcus at a small Italian restaurant near the hospital. He was being discharged the next day and would need help getting around for a few weeks while his arm healed. "I've been thinking," I said as we waited for our food to arrive, "about something you could help me with." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "I'm thinking about starting a foundation. Something to help kids who age out of the foster care system, or kids who get kicked out of their homes like I did. Scholarships, mentoring programs, maybe even transitional housing." "That sounds amazing. But what does it have to do with me?" "I need someone I trust to help run it. Someone who understands what it's like to hit rock bottom and claw your way back up. Someone who knows how to talk to people who've made mistakes and want to do better." Marcus stared at me. "You want me to work for you?" "I want you to work with me. This wouldn't be charity, Marcus. It would be a real job with real responsibilities and a real salary. But it would also be a chance to turn everything that went wrong in our family into something that could help other families avoid the same mistakes." He was quiet for a long time, turning the idea over in his mind. "What about Mom and Dad?" he asked finally. "What about them? Would this foundation, would it help people like them? People who made bad choices and ended up losing everything?" I considered the question carefully. "Maybe. If they were willing to do the work to earn help instead of just expecting it to be handed to them." Marcus nodded slowly. "I think I'd like that. Helping people who want to help themselves." 6 months later, the Rivera Foundation opened its doors in a converted warehouse in downtown Detroit. Marcus had moved into an apartment 3 blocks away and was working as our program coordinator, managing relationships with social workers, school counselors, and community organizations. We'd helped 12 kids find temporary housing, provided college scholarships to 8 high school seniors, and started a mentoring program that paired young adults with successful professionals who'd overcome similar challenges. And on a cold Saturday morning in March, exactly 10 years after I'd walked out of their house for what I'd thought was the last time, my parents showed up at the foundation office. I was in the conference room with Marcus, reviewing applications for our summer internship program, when our receptionist knocked on the door. "Lila, there's some people here to see you. They say they're your parents." I looked at Marcus, who shrugged like he was as surprised as I was. "Send them in," I said. They looked older than I'd expected, more fragile. My mother's hair had gone completely gray, and she walked with a slight stoop that suggested her arthritis was getting worse. My father seemed to have shrunk, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that had once been broader and stronger. "Hello, Lila," my mother said quietly. "Thank you for seeing us." "What can I do for you?" "We heard about what you're doing here," my father said. "About the foundation. We wanted to—" He stopped, looking uncertain. "We wanted to see if maybe we could help," my mother finished. "Volunteer, or whatever you need. We don't have money to donate, but we have time." I studied their faces, looking for the manipulation I'd grown so accustomed to, the subtle pressure that had always accompanied their requests for help. But all I saw was two tired people who were trying to figure out how to make amends for choices they couldn't undo. "What kind of help did you have in mind?" Marcus asked. "We've been thinking about the kids you work with," my mother said. "The ones who don't have families or whose families have given up on them. We thought maybe we could be, I don't know, like grandparents to some of them. People who could provide a home-cooked meal or help with homework or just be there when they need someone to talk to." It wasn't what I'd expected. It wasn't an apology or a request for money or an attempt to rebuild our relationship. It was an offer to do for other kids what they'd failed to do for their own daughter. "There would be background checks," I said. "Training requirements. Supervision." "We understand," my father said. "We know we don't have the right to ask for your trust, but maybe we could earn it." I looked at Marcus, who gave me an almost imperceptible nod. "All right," I said. "Let's talk about what that might look like." It wasn't forgiveness exactly. It was something more practical and more complicated. A chance for all of us to take the broken pieces of our family and build something useful from them. Not for us, but for kids who needed what we'd never been able to give each other. And maybe, if we were very careful and very lucky, we might figure out how to be a family while we were at it. 3 years after my parents first walked into the Rivera Foundation office, I found myself standing in the kitchen of a house I never thought I'd own again. 1247 Maple Ridge Drive had come up for auction 6 months earlier, and I'd bought it. Not out of nostalgia or sentimentality, but because it represented something I'd never had before: the power to rewrite endings. The house had been gutted and renovated, transformed from the place where a 16-year-old girl had been told she was worthless into something entirely new. The kitchen, where my mother had once screamed at me about attitude problems, now housed a commercial-grade coffee machine and a bulletin board covered with photos of foundation scholarship recipients. The living room, where my father had pointed to the door and told me to figure life out on my own, was now a comfortable meeting space where we held support groups for young adults transitioning out of foster care. I wasn't living in the house. My life was still in Phoenix, where I'd been promoted to Chief Technology Officer at Meridian Energy Solutions, and was working on projects that would reshape how the entire electrical grid operated. But the house on Maple Ridge had become the Foundation's residential program, a place where kids aging out of the system could live for up to 2 years while they finished high school, started college, or learned job skills that would support them for the rest of their lives. Today marked our 4th anniversary, and we were hosting an open house for the community. Former residents who'd gone on to college or careers would be returning to share their stories. Local business owners who'd hired our kids would be there to talk about the program's impact. City council members and school board officials would tour the facility and hear presentations about expanding the program to other neighborhoods. But the moment I was most nervous about was the one scheduled for 2 p.m., When my parents would be recognized for their volunteer service with the foundation, they'd been working with us for 3 years now, and their transformation had been as dramatic as anything I'd witnessed in my professional life. My mother, who'd once been consumed by her own grievances and financial anxieties, had become the foundation's unofficial grandmother, the person kids called when they needed someone to help them navigate paperwork for college applications or just wanted advice about relationships and life decisions. My father, who'd spent most of my childhood emotionally absent and bitter about his circumstances, had discovered a talent for teaching practical skills. He ran workshops on basic car maintenance, home repair, and financial literacy, all the things he'd failed to pass on to his own children, but was now sharing with kids who desperately needed those tools. The irony wasn't lost on me that they'd become better parents to other people's children than they'd ever been to Marcus and me, but I'd learned to see that as progress, rather than a painful reminder of what we'd missed. Marcus was in the kitchen setting up for the afternoon's presentations when I arrived that morning. He'd been living in a small apartment above the foundation office for the past year, serving as our live-in coordinator and the person residents could turn to when they needed someone who understood what it felt like to mess up and start over. "Are you ready for today?" he asked, looking up from the stack of programs he was arranging on the counter. "As ready as I can be," I said. "Are they nervous?" "Mom's been practicing her speech for 2 weeks. Dad keeps asking if he really has to talk in front of people or if he can just stand there and look official." I laughed despite myself. Some things never changed. The open house started at noon, and by 12:30, the house was full of people whose lives had intersected with ours in ways I could never have imagined when I was growing up here. There was Jessica, who'd aged out of foster care at 18 and was now finishing her nursing degree at Wayne State. There was Michael, who'd been homeless for 6 months before finding the foundation and was now working as an apprentice electrician. There was Destiny, who'd been living in her car after her grandmother died and was now in her 2nd year of community college studying early childhood education. Each of them had a story about how the foundation had provided not just housing or financial support, but something more fundamental, the belief that their future could be different from their past. At 2 p.m., I stood in front of the assembled crowd and felt something I'd never experienced in this house before. Pride. Not the defensive, desperate kind of pride I'd felt as a teenager trying to prove I was worth something, but the quiet satisfaction that comes from building something meaningful. When I was 16 years old, I began, I was told that I was a waste of space in this house. Today, this same house provides space for young people to discover their worth, to build their futures, and to learn that family isn't just about blood relationships. It's about people who show up for each other when it matters. I talked about the foundation's mission, about the kids we'd helped, and the community partnerships we'd built. I talked about the importance of believing in people even when they'd been told they weren't worth believing in. And then I called my parents to the front of the room. They looked small standing there together, but also somehow more substantial than they'd ever seemed when I was growing up. My mother was holding a piece of paper with notes she'd written, her hands shaking slightly with nervousness. My father stood beside her with his shoulders squared, wearing the same expression he'd worn when he'd taught me to change a tire in the driveway when I was 14. 3 years ago, my mother began, her voice quiet but steady, our daughter invited us to volunteer with this foundation. Not because she needed us, but because the kids here needed what we had to offer. It was the first time in years that anyone had asked us to give instead of asking us to take. She paused, looking out at the crowd, then continued. We failed our own children in ways that we're still learning to understand. We let fear and pride and our own limitations prevent us from being the parents they deserved. We can't change that. We can't go back and make different choices. But we can try to make sure that other kids don't suffer because of the same mistakes we made. My father stepped forward then, his voice gruff but equally sincere. These kids, he said, gesturing toward the young adults scattered throughout the room, They don't care about our regrets or our excuses. They care about whether we're going to show up when we say we will, whether we're going to listen when they need someone to talk to, whether we're going to believe in them even when they don't believe in themselves. He looked directly at me then, and for a moment I saw not the man who'd failed me as a father, but the man who'd learned to be something better. "We're honored to be part of this work," he continued, "and we're grateful to our daughter for showing us that it's never too late to learn how to be useful." The applause that followed wasn't just polite acknowledgement. It was genuine appreciation for two people who'd found a way to transform their mistakes into service. As the crowd dispersed and people moved on to tour the rest of the house, I found myself alone in the kitchen with my parents for the first time in years. "Thank you," my mother said quietly, "for giving us a chance to do something right." "Thank you for taking it," I replied. We weren't a reconciled family in any traditional sense. We didn't have regular dinners together or exchange holiday gifts, or pretend that the past had been anything other than what it was. But we'd found a way to work together toward something larger than our individual pain, and that felt more valuable than any fairy tale ending could have been. Later that evening, after all the guests had gone home and the house had been cleaned up, I walked through the rooms alone. In the bedroom that had once been mine, two young women were now living while they finished their GED programs and prepared for college. The basement where I'd been banished during my final months at home had been converted into a study space, with computers and tutoring resources. Every corner of the house had been transformed, made useful in ways that honored both what had been lost and what could still be built. I ended my walk in the backyard, where Marcus had taught me to build snowmen, and where I'd spent countless hours as a child reading under the old oak tree that still dominated the far corner of the yard. The tree was bigger now, its branches reaching higher and spreading wider, but its roots were the same ones that had anchored it when I was small. Marcus found me there as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded me of better moments from our childhood. "Pretty good day," he said, settling onto the back steps beside me. "Yeah, it was." "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if things had been different?" he asked. "If they'd handled everything better when we were kids?" I considered the question, one I'd asked myself countless times over the years. "I used to," I said. "But I've realized that wondering about alternate histories is just another way of staying stuck in the past. The question that matters is what we do with the present we actually have. And what do you think we should do with it?" I looked at the house behind us, glowing with warm light from the windows where young people were probably doing homework or having conversations about their futures. I thought about the foundation offices downtown, where staff members were working on applications for new programs and partnerships. I thought about the kids who'd moved through our program and were now building lives that would have been impossible without someone believing in their potential. "I think we keep building," I said. "We keep showing up. We keep proving that people can change, that families can be created rather than just inherited, that being thrown away doesn't mean you're worthless. It just means you get to choose what to build next." Marcus nodded, and we sat in comfortable silence as the day faded into evening. The 16-year-old girl who'd walked out of this house with nothing but a duffel bag and $43 had been told she was a waste of space. She'd been rejected by the people who were supposed to love her unconditionally, cast aside when she became inconvenient, and left to figure out survival on her own. But that girl had been wrong about one thing. She'd thought she was losing a family. What she was actually doing was graduating from one that had failed her and beginning the long, difficult, ultimately rewarding process of building something better. The Rivera Foundation wasn't just about helping kids transition out of foster care or providing resources for young adults who'd been abandoned by their families. It was proof that the most powerful response to being told you're worthless isn't to prove your worth to the people who rejected you. It's to build something so meaningful that their opinion becomes irrelevant. I'd spent years angry at my parents for choosing my brother's addiction over my potential, for prioritizing their own comfort over their daughter's future, for failing to see my value when it mattered most. But anger, I'd learned, was just grief wearing a disguise. What I'd really been mourning was the loss of the family I'd needed them to be. Now, surrounded by young people who were building their own chosen families and creating their own definitions of success, I understood that some losses are actually liberations. Being thrown away had freed me to discover what I was really capable of building. Being rejected had forced me to develop the strength and skills I'd needed to create something unprecedented. And maybe, most importantly, being failed by my original. Family had taught me how to build better ones, not just for myself, but for kids who needed someone to show them that their beginning didn't have to determine their ending. The girl who'd been called a waste of space had grown up to create space for others to discover their worth. The daughter who'd been deemed disposable had built something that would outlast any individual disappointment or betrayal. The child who'd been told she was the problem had engineered solutions that would help hundreds of other children avoid the same fate. That wasn't revenge. It was a transformation. And it was the most powerful kind of victory possible, the kind where everyone who's willing to do the work gets to win. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.